If you respect this flag, prove it. Harold Morrison stood up in the middle of Elvis's concert, holding the folded American flag above his head like a weapon. The 70-year-old Vietnam veteran's voice cut through "Love Me Tender" like a battle cry, silencing 2,200 people instantly. Elvis stopped singing mid-verse, his face shifting from performer to man as he stared at this broken father who was demanding something no entertainer had ever been asked to give. "This flag covered my son's coffin. He died in Vietnam while you made millions." The challenge hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Security guards started moving, but Elvis raised his hand to stop them. The king of rock and roll faced a moment that would define not just his career but his character. How do you respond to a grieving father's rage? How do you honor a sacrifice you never made? How do you bridge the gap between entertainment and reality when a man's entire world has been destroyed by war? What Elvis did next would either prove he was worthy of his crown, or reveal him as just another performer hiding behind fame. But to understand why this moment would transform both men forever, you need to know about the night Harold received that flag, and the promise he made that was slowly destroying him. It was Memorial Day weekend, 1974, at the Las Vegas International Hotel. Elvis was performing his second show of the evening to a sold-out crowd of 2,200 people. The intimate venue was electric with anticipation as he moved through his greatest hits. In the third row, center section, sat Harold Morrison, a 70-year-old factory worker from Detroit who had driven 18 hours straight to be there. This wasn't his first Elvis concert. In fact, it was his 6th consecutive year attending the exact same Memorial Day weekend show. But Harold Morrison wasn't an Elvis fan. He wasn't there for the music, the spectacle, or the chance to see a legend perform. Harold was there for a much darker reason, carrying a burden that had been crushing him for 6 years. Clutched against his chest was a folded American flag, the same flag that had been draped over his son Michael's coffin when the boy came home from Vietnam in a box. The flag was all Harold had left of his 20-year-old son, and tonight, after 6 years of silent suffering, he was about to do something that would shock the entertainment world and change the life of the most famous man on earth. To understand what drove Harold to this breaking point, you have to know about Michael Morrison, the golden boy who had everything to live for and lost it all in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Michael was Harold's only child, born when Harold was 50 and his wife Margaret was 45. They had tried for children for 23 years before Michael came along, and when he finally arrived, he brought a joy to their lives that seemed to make up for all the years of waiting and hoping. Michael was everything a father could want in a son. He was smart, graduating valedictorian from Detroit Central High School. He was athletic, earning a full scholarship to the University of Michigan for football. He was kind, spending his weekends volunteering at the local Veterans Administration hospital, reading to wounded soldiers and playing cards with lonely old men who reminded him of his grandfather. When the boy turned 18 in 1967, the Vietnam War was raging, and many of his classmates were finding ways to avoid the draft. Some went to college, others fled to Canada, and a few got married quickly to claim exemptions. Michael Morrison did none of these things. Instead, he walked into the Army recruitment office 3 days after his high school graduation and enlisted voluntarily. "Dad," Michael had said that night at dinner, his young face serious beyond his years. "Other boys are dying over there while I'm safe at home. That's not right. I need to do my part." Harold had never been prouder of anyone in his entire life. Here was a boy who understood duty, honor, and sacrifice. Here was a son who would make any father proud. Michael left for basic training at Fort Benning in Georgia. In August, his letters home were full of optimism and determination. He wrote about the friends he was making, the training he was receiving, and his excitement about serving his country. "The instructors say I'm a natural leader," he wrote in one letter. "They're recommending me for officer training school. Can you believe it? Your son might become a lieutenant." Harold kept every letter, reading them over and over until he had memorized every word. Margaret would find him in his workshop at night, holding Michael's latest letter and smiling with pride. "Our boy is going to be fine," Harold would tell her. "He's strong, he's smart, and he believes in what he's doing." God will watch over him. Michael completed his training and was shipped to Vietnam in February 1968. Arriving just weeks after the Tet Offensive had shown America how brutal and unpredictable this war could be. His letters from Vietnam were different from his training letter. They were shorter, more serious, and filled with details that Harold didn't fully understand but that made him worry late into the night. "The enemy is everywhere and nowhere," Michael wrote in March 1968. "We patrol during the day and get attacked at night. Lost 2 good men this week. Johnson and Martinez, you would have liked them, Dad. They talked about their families all the time, just like I talk about you and Mom. It's funny how being this far from home makes you realize what really matters." The last letter Harold received from his son was dated May 15, 1968. It was the longest letter Michael had ever written, and it contained something that would haunt Harold for the rest of his life. In that letter, Michael talked about the music the soldiers listened to on their portable radios, the songs that helped them forget where they were and remember what they were fighting for. "There's one song that plays all the time over here," Michael wrote. "It's called Love Me Tender by Elvis Presley. I know you think Elvis is just noise, Dad, but this song is different. It's quiet and peaceful, and when it comes on the radio, even the toughest soldiers get quiet and think about home. I think about you and Mom when I hear it. I think about Sunday dinners and working in the garage with you and all the normal things that seem so far away now. When I get home, I want us to go see Elvis perform that song. I want to hear it the way it's supposed to be heard, with people who understand what it means to miss someone you love." Harold had read that letter 100 times, imagining the day his son would come home and they would go to see Elvis together. He had even started putting money aside for the tickets, planning the trip they would take to Las Vegas to celebrate Michael's safe return. The letter that changed everything arrived on May 22, 1968, exactly 1 week after Michael's last letter home. Harold was in his workshop when Margaret called him to come inside. He could tell from her voice that something was wrong, but nothing could have prepared him for what he found in his living room. 2 soldiers in dress uniforms stood at attention in Harold's doorway, their faces grave and professional. The older one, a captain, stepped forward and spoke the words that every military family dreads. "Mr. Morrison, we regret to inform you that your son, Private First Class Michael Morrison, was killed in action on May 20, 1968, while serving his country in the Republic of South Vietnam." The details came in fragments that Harold's mind could barely process. Michael had been on patrol near the Cambodian border when his unit was ambushed. He had been point man, the soldier who walks ahead of the others to scout for danger. A hidden sniper had taken him with a single shot. He died instantly, they said, as if that was supposed to be a comfort. The funeral was held on June 1, 1968, with full military honors. Harold stood beside his son's grave and watched as 7 soldiers fired 3 volleys into the sky in Michael's honor. He watched as a bugler played taps, the mournful notes hanging in the air like a prayer for the dead. And he watched as 2 soldiers carefully folded the American flag that had covered Michael's coffin, presenting it to him with the words, "On behalf of a grateful nation." That night, alone in his workshop with the folded flag in his hands, Harold Morrison made a promise that would define the rest of his life. "I will never let anyone forget what you died for," he whispered to the flag, as if Michael could hear him. "I will never let them treat your sacrifice like it doesn't matter. I will make sure the world remembers that freedom isn't free, and that boys like you paid the price for other people's happiness." It was a promise born of grief and love, but it became a prison that trapped Harold in his pain. For the first year after Michael's death, Harold threw himself into honoring his son's memory. He joined veterans organizations, spoke at Memorial Day ceremonies, and visited schools to talk about the importance of military service. He became known in Detroit as the Gold Star Father, a man who had given his only son to his country and wore that sacrifice like a badge of honor. But as the months passed and the Vietnam War became increasingly unpopular, Harold began to feel like his son's sacrifice was being forgotten, even dishonored. Protesters burned flags in the streets. Young people called soldiers baby killer. Politicians who had sent boys like Michael to war now claimed they had been wrong all along. The breaking point came in the summer of 1969, when Harold attended a peace rally where he heard a young man say, The only good thing about Vietnam is that it's finally ended. All those soldiers died for nothing. Harold had to be physically restrained from attacking the speaker. That night, he sat in his workshop holding Michael's flag and feeling like the entire world had betrayed his son's memory. It was Margaret who suggested they go to Las Vegas for Elvis's Memorial Day concert in 19. Michael loved that song, she said quietly. Maybe hearing it would help us feel close to him again. Harold had resisted at first. The last thing he wanted was to hear love songs while his boy lay cold in the ground. But Margaret insisted, and Harold couldn't deny his grieving wife anything. That first concert was torture for Harold. He sat in the third row clutching Michael's flag, listening to Elvis sing about love and dreams and happiness, while all Harold could think about was his son's body lying in a jungle on the other side of the world. When Elvis performed Love Me Tender, Harold had to leave the theater. He couldn't bear to hear the song that had meant so much to Michael being sung for people who had never sacrificed anything. But something strange happened as Harold stood outside the theater, smoking a cigarette and fighting back tears. He could hear Elvis's voice through the walls, and for just a moment he could almost imagine Michael sitting in that audience, enjoying the music, alive and happy. For just a moment the pain lessened, and Harold felt something like peace. He went back inside and finished watching the concert. The next year, 1971, Harold returned to Las Vegas for the same Memorial Day weekend show. This time, he was prepared for the emotional impact. He brought Michael's flag again, but instead of leaving when Elvis sang Love Me Tender, he stayed and listened. As Elvis's voice filled the theater, Harold closed his eyes and imagined his son was there with him, enjoying the music he had loved. It became an annual ritual. Every Memorial Day weekend from 1970 to 1974, Harold Morrison drove from Detroit to Las Vegas, bought a ticket to Elvis's concert, and sat in the third row with his son's flag. It was the one time each year when he felt close to Michael, when the boy's death seemed to have some meaning. But by 1974, the ritual had become something darker. Harold's grief had curdled into anger, and his annual pilgrimage to see Elvis had become less about honoring Michael's memory and more about confronting his own pain. As he sat in that theater year after year, watching Elvis entertain people who had never known war, never lost a child, never made a real sacrifice, Harold began to feel like he was watching an obscene display of wealth and privilege built on the backs of boys like his son. The anger had been building for months before the 1974 concert. Harold had been watching the news, seeing how the Vietnam War was ending in defeat and humiliation. All those boys had died for nothing. Michael had died for nothing. And meanwhile, entertainers like Elvis Presley were making millions of dollars, singing love songs to audiences who had never heard a shot fired in anger. This year, he wouldn't sit silently while Elvis sang about love and dreams. This year, he would stand up and demand that someone, somewhere, acknowledge what his son had given for this country. He would wait until Elvis sang Love Me Tender, Michael's favorite song. Then he would stand up, hold his son's flag high, and demand that Elvis and everyone in that audience show some respect for the boys who had died so they could enjoy their freedom. He had practiced his speech during the 18-hour drive from Detroit, rehearsing the words until they were burned into his memory. My son died for that flag. He died so you could stand on that stage and sing love songs. The least you can do is acknowledge his sacrifice. But when the moment came, when Elvis actually began singing Love Me Tender, something inside Harold snapped. All the grief, all the anger, all the years of watching his son's sacrifice be forgotten, erupted out of him in a way he hadn't planned. Instead of giving his rehearsed speech, Harold found himself screaming from a place of pain so deep he didn't know it existed. If you respect this flag, prove it. The words echoed through the stunned theater as 2,200 people turned to stare at the broken old man holding a folded flag above his head like a weapon. Elvis stopped singing, his face registering shock, confusion, and something that looked like genuine concern. What happened next would change everything. For a moment that seemed to last forever, nobody moved. Elvis stood on stage, microphone in hand, staring down at Harold Morrison with an expression of complete bewilderment. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether they were witnessing a mental breakdown, a protest, or something else entirely. Security guards hesitated, waiting for Elvis to signal what they should do. Harold stood in the third row, trembling with 6 years of suppressed grief. holding his son's flag above his head and breathing hard from the effort of finally saying what he had been feeling for so long. The silence stretched out like a held breath, pregnant with possibility and danger. Then Elvis did something that no one expected. Instead of signaling for security, instead of trying to ignore the disruption and continue with the show, Elvis set down his microphone and walked to the edge of the stage. He looked directly into Harold's eyes and spoke in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly through the theater's sound system. "Sir," Elvis said, his voice respectful and serious, "I can see that flag means everything to you. Would you mind telling me about—" The question caught Harold off guard. He had expected Elvis to have him thrown out, or to make a joke, or to simply ignore him and keep singing. He hadn't expected this gentle, respectful invitation to share his story. For a moment, Harold's anger faltered, replaced by confusion and something that might have been hope. "It covered my son's coffin," Harold said, his voice breaking. "He died in Vietnam. He was 20 years old." Elvis nodded slowly, his face grave. "What was your son's name?" Michael Morrison. He loved your music. He wrote to me from Vietnam about that song you just sang. He wanted to come see you perform when he got home." The theater was absolutely silent. 2,200 people were witnessing something unprecedented. A conversation between a grieving father and a rock star about loss, sacrifice, and the true cost of freedom. Elvis was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was thick with emotion. "Mr. Morrison, I want you to know that I have nothing but respect for your son and for every young man who served in Vietnam. They answered their country's call and they paid a price that the rest of us can never fully understand." Harold felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the knot of anger and pain that had been choking him for 6 years. Here was Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, speaking about Michael with the kind of respect and gravity that Harold had been desperate to hear from anyone. "But sir," Elvis continued, "I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll forgive me if it sounds presumptuous. Do you think your son would want you to carry this pain the way you're carrying it? Do you think he would want his memory to be associated with anger instead of love?" The question hit Harold like a physical blow. He thought about Michael's letters, full of love for his family and optimism about the future. He thought about the boy who had volunteered to serve because he believed it was the right thing to do, not because he was angry or bitter. He thought about Michael's favorite song, "Love Me Tender," and how it had brought his son comfort in the middle of a war zone. He was a good boy," Harold said, his voice barely audible. "He believed in doing what was right. He believed in love, in family." Harold's voice broke completely, and the flag in his hands began to shake. Elvis stepped down from the stage. What happened next would become one of the most powerful moments in the history of live performance. Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll, walked through the audience to where Harold Morrison stood. He reached out his hand and gently touched the folded flag that Harold was holding. "Miss Morrison," Elvis said, his voice quiet enough that the theater's microphones barely picked it up, "would you do me the honor of letting me sing that song for your son? Not for the audience, not for the show, but for Michael." Harold looked into Elvis's eyes and saw something he hadn't expected: genuine compassion, real understanding, and a depth of feeling that had nothing to do with show business and everything to do with basic human decency. "Yes," Harold whispered. "Yes, he would like that." Elvis nodded and walked back to the stage, but instead of returning to his position center stage, he sat down at the piano. The theater remained absolutely silent as Elvis placed his hands on the keys and began to play the opening notes of "Love Me Tender" in a way that was completely different from his usual performance. This version was slower, more intimate, filled with a tenderness and gravity that transformed the familiar love song into something approaching a hymn. As Elvis sang, Harold Morrison closed his eyes and held his son's flag against his chest. For the first time in 6 years, he allowed himself to remember Michael not as a casualty of war, but as the loving, optimistic boy who had written letters about finding comfort in music during the darkest days of his young life. When the song ended, the theater remained silent for several seconds before erupting in the most sustained applause Elvis had ever received. But it wasn't applause for entertainment. It was applause for witnessing something real, something sacred, something that transcended the usual boundaries between performer and audience. Elvis stood up from the piano and walked back to Harold Morrison. "Miss Morrison," he said, "I want you to know that from now on, every time I sing that song, I'll be thinking of Michael. His sacrifice won't be forgotten." The anger that had consumed him for 6 years was gone, replaced by something he hadn't felt since the day he buried his son. Peace. But Elvis wasn't finished. "Sir, I'd like to ask you for a favor. Would you be willing to come backstage after the show? There's something I'd like to discuss with you." Harold agreed, though he had no idea what Elvis might want to talk about. As Elvis returned to the stage and continued with his concert, Harold remained standing for several minutes, holding Michael's flag and feeling like a weight he had been carrying for 6 years had finally been lifted from his shoulders. The rest of the concert passed in a blur for Harold. Elvis performed his usual repertoire of hits, but there was something different about his performance now, a gravity and sincerity that seemed to reach deeper than entertainment. Several times during the show, Elvis looked directly at Harold and nodded, as if to confirm that their earlier exchange had been real and meaningful. When the concert ended, security escorted Harold backstage to Elvis's dressing room. Harold had never been backstage at any kind of performance, and he was surprised by how different it was from what he had imagined. Instead of glamour and excitement, he found Elvis sitting alone in a simple room, still in his white jumpsuit, but somehow looking smaller and more human than he had appeared on stage. "Mr. Morrison," Elvis said, standing up when Harold entered. "Thank you for waiting. Please, sit down. Can I get you something to drink? Coffee? Water?" Harold accepted a cup of coffee and sat across from Elvis, still clutching Michael's flag. For several minutes, neither man spoke. Finally, Elvis broke the silence. "I want to tell you something," Elvis said, "and I hope you'll understand why it's important to me. I never served in the military. When I was drafted in 1958, I could have gotten out of it. My manager wanted me to join the special services and just perform for the troops, stay safe, keep making movies and records. But I decided to serve as a regular soldier. I wanted to do my duty like any other young man." Harold nodded, unsure where this was leading. "I served 2 years in Germany," Elvis continued, "and it was one of the most important experiences of my life. Not because of anything dramatic that happened, but because it taught me what it meant to be part of something bigger than myself. It taught me about duty, honor, sacrifice. It taught me about the kind of men who serve their country." Elvis paused, looking directly at Harold. "Men like your son. But I never saw combat," Elvis said, his voice becoming quieter. "I never had to face the kind of dangers that Michael faced. I never had to make the kind of sacrifices that he made. And sometimes when I'm up on stage, singing love songs to audiences who are just looking for entertainment, I wonder if I'm doing enough to honor the memory of young men like your son." Harold felt something shift in his understanding of the man sitting across from him. This wasn't the Elvis he had seen on stage, the larger-than-life entertainer who seemed to inhabit a world of pure glamour and fantasy. This was a man who thought seriously about duty and sacrifice, who felt the weight of his own good fortune, and wondered what obligations it created. "Tonight," Elvis continued, "when you challenged me to prove my respect for that flag, you made me realize something. It's not enough for me to just say that I respect the sacrifice of young men like Michael. I need to do something to show that respect, something meaningful and lasting." Elvis stood up and walked to a desk in the corner of the room. He returned with a piece of paper and a pen. "Miss Morrison, I want to make you a promise, and I want to write it down so that you know I'm serious." Elvis began to write, speaking aloud as he did. "I, Elvis Presley, promise to establish a scholarship fund in memory of Michael Morrison and all the young men who gave their lives in Vietnam. This fund will provide educational opportunities for the children of military families, ensuring that the sacrifice of young men like Michael creates something positive and lasting." Elvis finished writing and signed the paper with a flourish. He handed it to Harold, who read it with growing amazement. "This isn't just a promise," Elvis said. "I'm going to contact my business manager tomorrow and start setting this up. I want to create something that will honor your son's memory in a way that he would be proud of." Harold stared at the paper in his hands, unable to speak. In all his years of anger and grief, he had never imagined that his pain could lead to something like this, something that would help other families, something that would turn Michael's death into a force for good in the world. "There's something else," Elvis said. "I want you to come back next year, and the year after that, and every year for as long as I'm performing. Not as an angry father demanding recognition, but as my guest, representing all the families who have sacrificed for this country. Every Memorial Day weekend, I want to dedicate Love Me Tender to Michael and to every young man who didn't make it home." Harold looked up from the paper to find Elvis watching him with an expression of complete sincerity. "Would you be willing to do that, Mr. Morrison? Would you be willing to help me make sure that sacrifices like Michael's are never forgotten?" Harold felt tears streaming down his face, but for the first time in 6 years they weren't tears of anger or despair. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that felt almost like joy. He thought about Michael, about the letters his son had written from Vietnam, about the boy who had believed in love and duty and doing what was right. He thought about how proud Michael would be to know that his death had led to something meaningful, something that would help other families. "Mr. Presley," Harold said, his voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something. For 6 years I've been so angry. I've been angry at the war, angry at the politicians, angry at people who seem to forget what boys like Michael sacrificed. I came here tonight planning to embarrass you, to make you acknowledge my son's sacrifice in front of all these people. I wanted to hurt someone the way I've been hurting." Harold paused, looking down at Michael's flag. "But you've shown me something tonight that I had forgotten. You've shown me that there are still good people in this world. People who understand what honor means. People who care about more than just themselves. My son would have liked you, Mr. Presley. He would have been proud to know that his favorite singer cared enough to do something like this." Elvis reached across and gently placed his hand on Harold's shoulder. "Mr. Morrison, your son did something that I could never do. He gave his life for his country, for his beliefs, for people he had never met. The least I can do is make sure that sacrifice means something. The least I can do is try to be worthy of the freedom that boys like Michael died to protect." For the first time since his son's death, Harold Morrison smiled. "Yes," he said, his voice strong and clear. "Yes, I would be honored to help you. Michael would want me to say yes. He would want his death to mean something good." Elvis stood up and embraced Harold, and in that moment, something magical happened. 6 years of grief, anger, and bitterness began to transform into something else. Purpose, hope, and a determination to make sure that Michael Morrison's sacrifice would never be forgotten. The scholarship fund that Elvis established in Michael Morrison's name would eventually help hundreds of military families send their children to college. Every Memorial Day weekend for the rest of Elvis's career, Harold Morrison sat in the front row as Elvis's special guest, holding Michael's flag while Elvis dedicated Love Me Tender to the memory of all the young men who had given their lives for their country. These annual concerts became known as the Remembrance Show, attracting military families from across the country. Harold began speaking at veterans' events, telling how his anger had been healed by an unexpected act of compassion. Elvis himself was profoundly changed by his encounter with Harold Morrison. He started visiting Veterans Administration hospitals and began taking his performances more seriously when military families were in the audience. "Meeting Harold Morrison taught me something about the responsibility that comes with being in the public eye," Elvis said in 1975. "We can use our attention just for ourselves, or we can use it to honor people who deserve to be remembered." Harold Morrison lived until 1995, dying peacefully at the age of 91. In his will, he left Michael's flag to the Elvis Presley Memorial Foundation, with instructions that it be displayed as a reminder of how pain became healing. Margaret Morrison established a support group for military mothers, providing comfort to women whose children were serving overseas. Elvis performed thousands of concerts during his career, but he often said that his encounter with Harold Morrison was the most important moment of his professional life. It reminded him that behind every performance are real people with real pain and real stories that matter more than fame or fortune. Each recipient receives a letter telling the story of Harold Morrison, his son Michael, and the night when grief and compassion met on a Las Vegas stage. The letter ends with these words: "Michael Morrison died believing in love, duty, and the power of music to bring comfort in dark times." His father Harold learned that the best way to honor a sacrifice is not to carry it as a burden, but to transform it into a gift for others. May your education be that gift, and may you use it to make the world a little better, a little kinder, and a little more worthy of the sacrifices that made it possible. Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them, when pain meets compassion, when anger transforms into love, and when a simple song becomes a bridge between grief and healing. Harold Morrison came to that concert carrying 6 years of anger and left carrying hope. Elvis came to that stage as an entertainer and left as something more profound. A man who understood that his greatest performance wasn't about his voice or his charisma, but about his willingness to see the pain of another human being and respond with love. That's the real legacy of the night Harold Morrison challenged Elvis to honor his son's flag. Not the music, not the fame, not the spectacle, but the reminder that we all have the power to transform pain into purpose, grief into grace, and anger into love. All we have to do is be willing to listen, to care, and to act on the understanding that every person we meet carries a story that matters more than anything we might be doing when we meet them.